Chapter 41. Pollen in the Air, 4, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 41. Pollen in the Air, 4, Translator. Sean Su Editor. Sooty Owl. As expected, Nabi was sharp. Night. Darkness. The reason why Juho painted everything with darkness in the story was because he liked it. It must have had something in common with what he wanted to say. Just being born and alive felt really different to me at that moment. She listened to him with a serious expression. I've been mostly alone at school. I'm not very social. Because of that, I had all the time in the world to write. It had been true. Thanks to his non-existent social life, he had been able to finish a full-length novel. As Juho answered her with a smile, Nabi spoke about her past. I was alone in my old jobs as well. Adults have the same tendency to ostracize people. I even heard somebody talking about me in the restroom. It was painful. I'm a people pleaser, but it's really greed at the core of it. You can't please everyone. Somebody in this world is definitely hating me even to this moment. Nobody wanted to be hated, and she probably knew how weary it felt. Still, I caught myself being greedy again. I guess I haven't learned my lesson. Despite her feelings, she still considered how others felt. She hoped that the other person would consider her feelings in return. She kept trying as if she had never been hated. Maybe that was possible because she was aware that it was impossible to please everyone. It also meant that somebody in that world was fond of her. Juho and Nabi heard children laughing in the distance. I didn't have a dream. I didn't have a purpose either. I had all the time in the world, yet I did nothing, he said. This pattern had remained consistent as he had gotten older. When he had been accused of ghostwriting, he had left the literary world. He had been all alone. He had drunk and gambled every day. He had gotten used winning and, soon after, losing everything he had earned. He had known that the people around him had been tricking him. He had known that he had been nothing more than a bag of money to them. Still, he hadn't been able to stop on his own. He had been angry about the fact that there were many things in his own heart and body that were out of his control. He had drunk angrily. It had been a vicious cycle. Whenever I think about that time, I smell a corpse, Juho thought. Although the time kept ticking, he had remained still. It had been a state closest to death. A person who was alive couldn't smell like corpse. Yet, his body had reeked with the stench of death. So none of the characters at night are actually alive. They're less alive than a baby in his mother's womb. They're immature. Even as a young student in the past, he had known he had been dying. It had been dark, and it had been night. A morning that would never come. Back then, that's what he had been looking at. Having listened to Juho, Nabi said quietly, I see. Will you excuse me for a moment? Then, she headed to the restroom. In the meantime, Juho took a sip of his drink. Whoa, boy. This is insane. It's freakin' amazing, she murmured while leaning on the sink. If only she had permission to shout for joy. Everyone, look. I'm talking to Yunwoo. He's the youngest and the sexiest author I've met. Come see for yourselves. She had to put her hand over her mouth to force her excitement down. Her body was shaking. This is why I can't quit. There were countless interpretations to a single book. It wouldn't be an overstatement to say that there were as many as the number of readers. None of them gave an objective answer. Each critic was different. Even the words of an expert had no value if the readers didn't accept them. If somebody had been captivated by a book, it would be natural for them to be interested in the person who had created it. Among the countless people in that world, people who were in love spoke in a distinct language. That was the same for an author. Nabi decided to revisit The Trace of a Bird with the author's own interpretation. Okay. Breathe in, breathe out. Calm down. She fanned at her flushed face. The maturity coming out of Juho's mouth was unbelievable. It was dreamlike. Maturity dressed in baby skin. You're lethal, Mr. Wu, she thought. I'm so geeking out on this. Since she was young, she had always been fond of writers. They looked stylish to her eyes. Her emotions had reached its peak as she went into middle school. Yuk Sa Lee, Dong Ju Yoon, Tae Jun Park, Tae Won Lee, Sang Lee, So Wool Kim, Yi Young Kim, etc. Her heart raced whenever she thought about their lives and works. Of course, she didn't share that side of herself with anyone. She had only been active in a blog, under an alias. Man, I really made it as a geek. I'm so happy. She quickly fixed her makeup and made a resolution in her heart, I'm getting that exclusive partnership, no matter what. Sigh. Despite the resolution, she had failed. Yun Woo was stronger than she thought. How many times did he? She tried to think of how many times Yun Woo had declined her offer, but quickly gave up. She felt like she'd feel discouraged if she revisited each and every time he had said no to her. So, are you still pushing and pulling with Yun Woo? Isn't it obvious? A coworker asked while giggling obliviously, is he that difficult? He's not even that old. Age is not the issue here. I was jealous that you got to meet him, but now I'm glad that I don't have to go through what you're going through. You little. I'm going to have you work with coin if you don't shut up. She brought up the names of American authors who were infamous for their temper, and her coworker immediately backed down. I'm sorry. I'm going home now. Clean up after yourself. Yes, Captain. You're going on a business trip tomorrow, right? Have a safe trip. Thanks. When she arrived home, she prepared for her business trip. She dragged her weary body into the shower. After it, she took out her luggage. There hadn't been as much progress with Yun Woo as she would have liked, but she hadn't given up just yet. She had been incredibly busy as of late. The fact that she had heard from an agent she was close with was proof of that. He was an American named Molly, and she was thinking about what he had said. I've heard the news about this 16-year-old debuting as an author. Frankly, I'm still on the fence. It takes time for an author to really bloom. However, you seem to be certain of this, so I'll trust you for now. We'll discuss more in detail in person. There had been anticipation and doubt in his message. It was understandable. An author in his mid-40s was considered to be young in the world of literature. In that field, debuting at the age of 16 had to carry some significance. Yet, she was not concerned. Both the author and his work were outstanding. Even Molly, who was much more experienced as an agent, would understand the moment he read the book. She was already able to picture the meeting in her head. Molly would be drawn by Yun Woo's charm. Other publishing companies from other parts of the world would see what their agents had brought back and race for an idea. It won't be long until offers from overseas start flooding in, she thought. It was ecstatic just to think about it, but she wasn't going to let that stay in her imagination. I'm doing it. I'm doing this. She lay on her bed. She wanted to fight for the exclusive partnership even more. To an agent, an exclusive partnership was like a blinker to a horse, allowing it to keep looking forward. Sometimes, it took years of investment. A lot of things had to be spent. Spreading an author's book was not an easy task by any means. In order to make it through that long and strenuous journey, an exclusive partnership was essential. She had to believe the fact that she would be rewarded for the amount of effort she would have put in. It wasn't wise to keep working while bearing the loss. There had to be an insurance, and she wasn't going to let anything get in her way. That book had been written by Yun Woo, and she was certain of its international success. She wanted to take that project on at all cost, and she believed she had what it took. After a brief thought, she reached for her cell phone above her head. A series of signal sounds soon turned into a voice, the same voice she had just heard earlier today. Hello. Hi, how you doin', Mr. Wu? This is Nabi Beck. Juho answered with his distinct tone of voice, what are you calling about? Do you have some time tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you before I leave for a business trip. I do have time. One of the perks of being a student was that he had relatively more time than others who were older. She wanted to have another talk with him before her trip. Her schedule was about to get tighter, and she wouldn't be able to meet with him in person as often. After deciding on a time and a place, she hung up the phone. It was time for a final negotiation. I'm really doing this, she resolved in her heart once again. After finishing up the call, Juho looked at his work in progress in vain. I had a good feeling about this. The paper had gone cold since the call. He put down his pen and stretched. He felt pain in his tense shoulders. She was probably not going to beat around the bush tomorrow. She's a tenacious one, he thought with a faint smile. I believe it's here. He made his way to the place where he and Nabi had decided to meet. The situation was changing. He reminisced to the actual first encounter with her when he had been actually 16. Back then, he hadn't known anything about copyrights. Of course, Nam Kyung had given him an explanation, but he must have thought that the adult would take care of it. Although it had been his business, he had had a hands-off attitude. He had already been as full of himself as he could have possibly been. Failure had not even crossed his mind. The book had actually been doing well. He had had no clue of what kind of change that was going to bring. This could be worse than before. Maybe I don't even get to be homeless this time, he thought as he tried to calm himself. It was still much better than leading the same life he had in the past. He was living through a miracle. When he arrived at the cafe in the park, Nabi was already waiting, and she waved at him. You're early. He was also early, but she had been even earlier. She seemed to believe that it was not professional to keep her client waiting. The two agreed on walking around the park, each with a warm cup of coffee. Chapter 42. Pollen in the Air, 5, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 42. Pollen in the Air, 5, translator. Sean Su editor. Sudiao the weather was perfect for a walk. Juho and Nabi walked past the playground and into a trail. There was plenty of sunlight, and they walked without saying anything for a while. The sound of children playing rose in the distance. They sounded excited. What are they so excited about? Juho wondered. They almost sounded like they couldn't hold back the joy they were feeling. He looked in their direction and felt ever so slightly jealous. The breeze feels nice, Nabi said. She was in a good mood. It had been a while since she had gone out for a walk. When she was with this young author, it almost felt like the time went by slower than normal. She assumed that it had something to do with the unique, calming aura that surrounded him. It's especially nice today. The two kept up an empty conversation while walking. Neither tried to rush things. Nabi was the same way. The center of a typhoon tended to be quiet. As they reached the end of the trail, the botanical garden appeared up ahead. Should we? Sure, she agreed to his suggestion at once. If my client wants to go, that's where I'll be, she reminded herself. As they went inside, they were greeted by an earthy smell that was distinct to botanical gardens. The air was damp as if the plants were breathing. Among various tall growing trees, there were bird sculptures in between the branches. Palm trees and banana trees were showing off their enormous leaves. Blob, drop by drop, water dripped down from above. It's calm and peaceful here. It suits him, she thought. They walked together quietly. Soon, they reached a spot that seemed like a decorated pond. There were large carps swimming in the water. They walked past the pond and reached a flower bed. Red, orange, white, there were many colors, and the two stopped walking for a moment. They're pretty, he said. She had thought the same, but she ended up not saying it. She was more than capable of speaking her mind. It was easy, yet challenging. So, she answered with a faint smile, yes, they are. Where there were flowers, there were also bees. They flew around the flowers busily and took turns sitting on each flower to suck on the honey. They looked cute with their plump belly. I'm going on a business trip soon. I fly out tonight. I see, he answered briefly since he had already heard the news. She continued as she flexed her abdomen. His eyes slowly met with hers. I'll tell the people I'm meeting about you. About me. That an incredibly talented author has appeared, so whoever's capable needs to tell the world about Yun Woo's book. I'm not sure if they'll agree, he answered light-heartedly, but she was serious. They will. I'll make them. Why is that? It was a basic question, but she had never been asked such a question before. Why? It was simple, yet it reached deep into her heart. Still, she was prepared to answer that simple question. She had always been thinking about it. There was a clear reason. Because I'm your fan. Juho chuckled. I see. There are times when I can't tell if what I'm doing is work or a hobby. It happens when a book is amazing. Your book is like that. My work hasn't been feeling like work as of late. I'm intending on keeping it that way this time as well, she added to his response. She was slightly excited. She'd never had a conversation like that with an author. Her mind responded as if somebody was forcing it to, but it wasn't a bad feeling. He glanced over at her. It had been quite a compliment and, perhaps, slightly overbearing. It had sounded like there had been a word in the middle somewhere that was kind of odd, but he didn't mind. That wasn't what was important. She continued, I'm going to be working very hard for this. I want to distribute your book all across the world. She had great pride in her work. She loved that her job allowed the books to reach the many. A butterfly flew out of a yellow flower. It was a butterfly with white wings. As it sat on a flower, its petals shook a little bit. The butterfly busily moved its wings towards another flower. Nabi looked at Juho. He was peacefully following the butterfly with his eyes, and she couldn't figure out what he was thinking. Even after so many conversations, she still couldn't get a grasp of who he was. For that reason, she had given up. Instead, she had decided to be honest about herself. It's almost time. She closed her eyes as she checked the time on her wristwatch. She had given up. She didn't want to force things to happen. If things didn't work out, profit would no longer be a priority. She didn't want to ruin the moment. She had found satisfaction in the fact that she had simply gotten to have a conversation with Yun Woo. There was a gentle breeze. It wasn't clear where it was coming from. Through it, she heard the sound of Juho's voice, I would like for you to manage my books exclusively. He felt her staring in his direction. Pardon, she asked. Juho answered with a smile, I would like to leave my book to you. She didn't say anything for a moment. Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened. Her face flushed, and her eyes shook. She had countless things that she wanted to say at that moment, but she swallowed them all and answered, It'd be my pleasure, Mr. Woo. Ugh. My whole body's aching. She stretched as she walked out of the plane. Long flights were always exhausting. Yet, she still had a smile on her face. Whenever she thought about what Yun Woo had said, she felt invigorated all over again. That composure, he knew his push and pull too. He was going to grow up to be a heartbreaker. After getting into a taxi, she covered her face and twisted her body. She would never forget the conversation with Yun Woo by the flower bed. The moment she had decided to put everything down, there was his voice. This is some crazy stuff. She looked forward to his growth. She genuinely hoped for him to grow up to be an outstanding writer. She was even willing to invest a third of her paycheck into him. I'll buy every single one of his books. Her hands shook, and she smiled from ear to ear. She couldn't help herself. She felt satisfaction from just thinking about that day with Yun Woo. He is a great author. It is rewarding to work with him. It was his book that she had the privilege of working with, and she had to work as hard as she could for the best possible results. She took a deep breath. Breathe in, breathe out. Calm down. She cleared her throat when the driver gave her an odd look. Calm down. Phew. Finally here. She arrived at her hotel and unpacked her bag. It was almost time to meet with Molly. For the time being, she applied a pack onto her face. Hope the makeup comes out okay, she thought as she mentally prepared herself for the meeting. She had already bought a new perfume. To portray intelligence, she tied her hair in a ponytail and applied a nude lipstick onto her lips. The woman in the mirror was plenty beautiful, and she was satisfied with how she looked. I look good today. After applying her perfume as a final touch, she headed for the nearby cafe. She had been there with Molly from time to converse with him over tea. This time was no different. As she opened the door to the cafe, she was immediately greeted by the smell of roasted coffee beans. She walked past the black barista and went further into the cafe. Though the cafe was packed, one person stuck out in particular, a gentleman with white hair. Ian with Molly. Ah. It's been a while since I've seen you. Taking his eyes off the book he was reading, Molly raised his chin at the sound of Nabi's voice. They happily greeted each other. After ordering coffee, they took some time to catch up with one another. You know about Coin's new book, right? Of course. She has an incredible fan base in Korea. I've already prepared an offer. She drank her coffee. Speaking of which, she debuted pretty early too, didn't she? She was looking for the right timing to slip something in regarding Yun Woo. She wasn't received well at first. She was well acquainted with Kelly Coin's debut. She had debuted at an early age, but her book had not been well received. It had been harshly criticized in every possible way. When Nabi thought about it, the book hadn't actually been that bad. The jealousy towards Coin had been oddly strong at the time. Yet, she didn't wait to write her next book. Nabi tried to shake off the thoughts on Coin. She shook her head sideways and changed the subject. She had to focus from then on. Yun Woo is different. The trace of a bird is genuinely charming. It's controlled. This author speaks in a friendly manner, but there's a strong tone behind his words. The more you think about his age, the more shocked you will be. Controlled. It's hard to imagine. Right. She gave him a synopsis of the book and shared the clues that she had gotten out of her conversations with Juho. I've had many conversations with him, she spoke the truth. Bluffs or exaggerations wouldn't work with the veteran agent. I was shocked. It was hard to imagine his age from his attitude. We were able to communicate, and he had a deep understanding of literature. You'll know when you get a chance to read his book, but more than anything, his book is pure and childlike. Yet, the author himself might as well have been an adult. That's how calm he was. You're not usually this excited. I'm interested, he answered as he brought his coffee to his mouth. He was creating a buffer as the conversation picked up the pace. Yet, his eyes were sharp. He's definitely interested in Yun Woo, she thought. That was an opportunity. She continued with a slightly sad face, honestly, I initially wanted to have an upper hand in our interaction. I underestimated him because of his age. I wanted to talk him into working with me. That's a common mistake agents make. So how'd it go? By the time I came to my senses, I was being dragged around by him. He turned down my offer at once. He was still willing to have a conversation though. While I was waiting for an opening, he kept himself shut, but by the time I was about to give up, he wanted to work with me. Because of that, I'm on fire at the moment. Ha! He sounded astonished. She had to keep on. I don't think he'll stop at just one book. I came to learn that he has a serious attitude towards literature. She kept her eyes fixed on Molly as they spoke, and he listened to her carefully until the end. Chapter 43. The first meal in 3 days. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 43, The first meal in 3 days. Translator. Editor. I see what you're trying to do. I won't judge him by his age, Molly answered calmly as he brought his coffee to his mouth once again. By now, he was getting a grasp of that author's character and was slowly realizing that there was nothing ordinary about this Yun-woo Nabi had been talking about. From his perspective, Nabi didn't talk about her clients in too much detail. It was one of her strategies because higher expectations could also lead to greater disappointments. This time, it was different. She was full of confidence. No matter how high the expectation was, she was certain that he was not going to be disappointed. She hadn't been like that when she was working with Seo Jong-un not too long ago. Okay. I'm interested in taking a look. Do you have a sample for me? He said as he savored the nutty fragrance of coffee. Yes, of course. The materials she had prepared went over to Molly's hands. Here's a loaf of bread, Mr. Moon said as he placed a loaf of bread onto the desk with it still wrapped. All eyes were on the bread. It was a muffin. Turn this bread into gold. His mission didn't make a lot of sense, so Sun Hwa asked, what do you mean by, turn it into gold? The members looked at each other. Are you telling us to plate it with gold? Well, that's not too bad. Ju-ho Woo, give us an example, Mr. Moon spoke ambiguously. Then he looked at Ju-ho, who was resting his chin on his hand. Ju-ho stopped himself from smirking at being called out all of a sudden. He's so certain that I'll have something, he thought. What is it? Did you get it? Sun Hwa asked. Ju-ho did understand the instructions. Though he was planning on keeping his mouth shut, he was forced to speak by suddenly becoming the center of attention. A loaf of bread after starving for 3 days. Aha! Everyone understood with that one sentence alone. Just the thought alone was enough to understand how precious the bread must have been. Before a person who had been starving for 3 days, a loaf of bread would be much more precious than gold. They probably wouldn't trade it for gold. I see. That's what he meant, Seo Kwang murmured. Altogether, the club members understood the entirety of that day's lesson from Ju-ho's example. Once they understood, it actually sounded fun, and everyone willingly started discussing their ideas with one another. Okay, let's do this. They brainstormed as they sat around the bread. That loaf of bread had to be made precious, so everyone thought as hard as they could while looking piercingly at its smooth, golden brown surface. What if everyone was sharing a loaf? Billam said. It probably makes the bread more valuable than it is when only one person's eating it. Wouldn't it still be less valuable than gold? Yeah, I guess you're right. She smiled awkwardly as she scratched her head. Ju-ho's example was stuck in their minds. They couldn't think of something different. Seo Kwang spoke up next, what about having a loaf to yourself without having anyone else knowing? That's a little ambiguous. Sun Hwa tilted her head, wouldn't he feel guilty for tricking others, she thought. The word betrayal was as far as it could be from the word gold. Seo Kwang argued, why? There's a saying that food tastes best when you're eating in secret. You don't know if someone chose to eat that loaf of bread in secret even with a piece of gold in front of you. Maybe he's right. Who would do that? This guy. You're funny. I think I'd feel guilty too. Gold would be better. Seo Kwang clicked his tongue at Bom's answer as he quarreled with Sun Hwa. Well, I think it depends on how you set the situation. Try to be more specific. For example, being surrounded by the people you'd hate to be around, Ju-ho said. I actually wouldn't feel all that guilty. What if everyone's stranded and on the verge of starving to death? It wouldn't be weird to choose bread over gold. Sun Hwa, Seo Kwang, and Baron answered Juho in order. Baron was drawing something on his sketchbook as he spoke nonchalantly. Bom clapped timidly, and Sunhwa placed her hand on her temple. She seemed upset. Why couldn't I think of that? Isn't it because you're not as quick as Juho? She retaliated with her hand at Seo Kwang, mocking her. As he looked at the two close friends, Juho said, "Let's not compare ourselves to others and make ourselves feel small. That tranquility. I hate how politically correct he can be." Haha. Juho laughed it off. Sunhwa glared at him as he laughed peacefully, and Bom said timidly, "Then the bread in another person's hand must look more valuable. There's a saying that the grass always looks greener on the other side." Clap, clap, clap. Mr. Moon clapped at Bom's words. He seemed proud of her. Their discussion was going much better than he had anticipated. "Then, let's try the opposite this time. Make it worthless. Less than dirt." The members got together excitedly, and Seo Kwang said, "Let it sit for a few days. It'll go bad, and nobody will be able to eat it." It was simple, but it wasn't wrong either. "You might as well throw it on the ground." Sunhwa seemed unsatisfied with his answer. Juho gave another example, "How about a leftover loaf? When a person had already had too much to eat, the smell of bread alone would be enough to make them nauseated. They'd probably want to go out and walk around more than anything. What's wrong with leftovers? It tastes fine once you microwave it. Besides, how do you not finish your bread? Have you heard of the 5-second rule?" Seo Kwang and Sunhwa presented their arguments simultaneously. Being the only person who agreed with Juho, Bom looked around timidly. Of course, they had stomachs of steel at that age. By the time everyone had enough opinions, Mr. Moon changed the subject of the discussion. He showed them a picture of a steep cliff. Its irregular surface gave off a dangerous feeling. "That cliff looks pathetic compared to the real thing," Seo Kwang said mischievously. It was true. A picture of a cliff didn't hold a candle to the actual cliff. Then, a clay wall made by a child has gotta be the same way. Sure, but wouldn't it be different for the parents? I guess so. They'd probably give anything for their child. They might give the child away for a gold. I know my mom wouldn't. They moved on to the next phase, and Seo Kwang said, "What about a cliff made of gold? That's not bad. Is that the best you got?" Sunhwa gave her opinion right after. Once the club members had a grasp of the activity, they raised and lowered the value of the subject. They had thought of a situation where a group of people simultaneously wanted the same thing. This time, Mr. Moon took out his cell phone. After tapping on its screen a few times, a sound came from his phone. Snore, PFF, snore, PFF, it was the rhythm of a person snoring. "Who's that? I can't tell you since it's my personal life." The members quickly resumed their discussion with their eyes. Could it be him? No, it can't be. Maybe a roommate. Maybe it's just sound effect. They came up with all sorts of speculation. Juho too was dying to know, but out of respect for his teacher, he decided not to dig too deep. He did admire Mr. Moon's passion for the club and ignored the suspicious looks the club members' eyes had as if on a mission. Make it more valuable than gold. Making a snoring sound more valuable than gold was not an easy task. Juho rested his chin on his hand and let everyone else speak first. What if the recorder was made of gold? Are you serious? This is creative too. What if that snore came from somebody who couldn't afford to be shown with their guard down? If it was the snore of a person who had a lot to lose from their personal life being exposed, they'd be bound to have enemies. Especially so if they had to appear dignified on a regular basis. If the person who recorded it were to sell what they had captured, they could probably ask for quite a bit, like a piece of gold, Juho thought as he listened to the two quarreling. At that moment, Sunhwa made a suggestion. How about this? What if we have people competing for who can snore the loudest for a gold prize? So. Called the snoring contest. The person in the recording would be the winner of the contest. Wouldn't it be worth the gold? Well, there are $1 million legs. I'm sure there's a snore that's worth a piece of gold somewhere in this world. If this contest took place at night, I'd hate to be anywhere around it. Next door as well, Juho added to Seo Kwang's remark. At least a family could wake him up. For a next-door neighbor, it would be a much more complicated situation. A snoring father, Bomb said timidly. She actually understood the mission now. Wouldn't a father snoring after a long, hard day at work be as precious as gold? I miss my dad all of a sudden. Seo Kwang and Sun Hwa said simultaneously. Juho thought of his father going to bed early after coming late from work. He snored quite loud at times, but he wanted his dad to be healthy more than anything else, even if that meant he would snore for the rest of his life. I've heard snoring is a sign of bad health, Sun Hwa said. Her sensitivity simply didn't last. The students came up with a few more ideas for their discussion. As he sat still listening to them, Mr. Moon suddenly stood from his seat when it was time they start wrapping up. All eyes were focused on him, and he opened a shelf and took something out. Is that for us? Sun Hwa asked. That's not. Juho said out of reflex. He recognized what it was at once. In the past, he had seen the label on the bottle countless times. This is alcohol. Mr. Moon had brought alcohol to school, and Seo Kwang said, this is going to get you fired. It's for educational purposes. Still. The school will call the parents. Not if I don't get caught, he answered briefly. It definitely wouldn't be good to be seen with alcohol at school. He had hid the bottle in a shelf because he was aware of that fact. Schools and alcohol didn't blend well. Juho stared into the shelf where the bottle was in. As familiar of the sight of it was quite entertaining. Everyone was excited. But why did you bring this? Are we going to drink it? I said it's for educational purposes. There was a blunt sound as he opened the bottle, and everyone exclaimed in astonishment. Juho squinched his eyes and looked at the bottle in Mr. Moon's hand. Now, make this cheap. I want to smell it. Seo Kwang raised his hand. He added an excuse as Mr. Moon looked at him. To allow for a more realistic imagination for the club members, he handed the bottle over to Seo Kwang without hesitation. Like a dog, he put his nose over it. No one said anything, but they all waited for their turns. It does smell like alcohol. Since coming up to high school, Seo Kwang had had experience with alcohol. His parents would let him take a few sips sometimes. However, seeing alcohol in school was an exciting experience. He passed the bottle to Sun Hwa as she rushed him impatiently. It smells like alcohol, she said. Chapter 44. Something I Saw. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 44, Something I Saw. Translator. Editor. Bom and Baron soon joined in on getting a whiff of the bottle. Lastly, it was Juho's turn. He looked at the bottle in his hand. Unlike the bottle he had been used to, it was clear. It smelled familiar. It smells like alcohol. It was the same smell he had reeked with at one point. He revisited how he felt then. He couldn't stop once he had started drinking. Whatever he needed to do would be ruined by his alcoholism. When he woke up the next day, he had been overcome with guilt. His memory slowly faded away, and he began to find broken things around him. Ugh! I hate this, Sun Hwa said as she shook her head. She was right. Juho hated it too. He felt that same helplessness from the past at the end of his fingertips. He tried clenching his fist, and it seemed to work fine. His body was functioning well even without alcohol. It was a young body. I should take good care of it, he thought. It smells like something an upperclassman would force you to drink, Boehm said. Ah. That's not something I'm looking forward to in college, Sun Wa answered vividly. Whenever she thought about her college life, it always ended up in worry. It was a time when people often died from alcohol poisoning. I've heard some people are allergic to alcohol. I figure they'd hate to even be around it, let alone smell them, Seo Kwang said. Everyone spoke with excitement. A bottle of alcohol brought about an odd sense of excitement to people underage. While watching, Mr. Moon snickered as he saw the excitement on everyone's faces. It was apparent that they were excited to have something foreign in their hands. They wouldn't be able to experience it anywhere else. When would it become fragrant? Juho asked as he thought, what could possibly be changed by this stench of alcohol? He couldn't reach an answer. I think it might not smell as bad after you drink with somebody you enjoy being around, Boehm said. We should all drink together when we grow up. Sun Wa added. Yeah. Let's eat fried chicken too. Seo Kwang told them the location of the fried chicken shop. Aren't you all too young for this? Baron scolded, but he wasn't saying that he wouldn't be there either. Does the fragrance become better as the company gets better? Juho reminisced. He had never drunk out of joy. Perhaps that's why he had reeked. Although, I'm sure all alcohol smells pretty much the same, he said. The students jeered at Juho's murmur. It was a sign that he was being a killjoy. Aren't you going to come? You don't want to drink with us when you're older. He took a deep breath. He smelled happiness. Drinking with those friends as adults didn't sound half bad. I'll be there, Juho answered with a smile. There's dust here too. Where's the person on duty? Do you not see me down here? Oh, I thought you were stretching. Who stretches with a broomstick in his hand? Cleaning duty was appointed by rotation. Juho poked fun at Seo Kwang. He was bored. There wasn't much else to do aside from poking fun at Seo Kwang. After staring out the window for a while, he packed his bag and said, I'll be in the science room. Okay. Nothing was going to change even if he was in the science room, but he figured it'd be better than inhaling dust in the class. While he was heading toward the stairway, he saw Mr. Moon coming down. Since he couldn't see Juho in the distance, he went straight into the staff room. Juho didn't really feel the need to call out his name, so he too headed straight to the science room. When he went inside, the window was open. Mr. Moon must have kept it open for ventilation. He walked past the desk and stood in front of the window. He had just come from a dusty place, so even the slightest breeze felt all the more refreshing. There was the sound of kids playing in the schoolyard. They were shouting something. Most of them sounded playful and mischievous. As he leaned against the window, his eyes naturally went to the top of the desk. He saw his paper and notebook. Did Seo Kwang really read my notebook at a time like this, he thought. Mr. Moon wasn't very careful when it came to where he kept his notebooks. It could have even been taken by other students. Well, the only ones who would intentionally walk into the science room would have been the literature club members. He looked out the door. Nobody had arrived yet, and there was no sound of footstep. If there was something written where he was, then there was only one thing left to do. He sat down and picked up the very top page. Their papers were kept in a translucent file, and the page on the top was written by Sun Wa. She's impatient. That was Juho's impression after reading her composition. The steps toward the climax were mostly left out. Tension had been at its peak since the beginning of the development. It was more like a field day than the anticipation for it. No push. Just pulling. One would describe her progression to be wild. At once, he understood what Mr. Moon had pointed out in her writing. It is pretty entertaining. Her best work was the paper she wrote at the subway station. It started with this sentence. A bomb exploded in the subway station. There was no mention of how it was installed or any suspicious activities. No mention of people peacefully going about their days either. Just like that, she had made the bomb go off. As long as the progression was under control, the story still had the potential to be exciting even with an abrupt intro like that. Unfortunately, such a control was beyond what Sun Hua was capable of. A bomb had exploded, but the culprit got caught immediately, and then he let out his pent-up anger. It sounded more like she was wrapping up the story than she was setting up a beginning. Juho appreciated its experimental nature, but it wasn't appropriate considering the lesson was about writing up to the beginning. It did get better as it went on, but if the story stayed at a climax throughout, it would be the same as a story without tension or resolution, only moving forward. It seemed like Sun Hua was in desperate need of patience. If she learned how to write in steps, she'd be a much better writer. If the fourth floor was the floor above the first, one would be ripped in half trying to get there. At least he'd be able to enjoy the view if he could make it up to the top. This one's written by Bomb. Like Sun Hua's, it was in a translucent file. The notebook was the same as Sun Hua's. The entire club knew that they were close friends. This is pretty good. It was quite decent. The pace wasn't too fast or slow. However, her story wasn't what caught his attention. Her biggest strength was her detailed style and her description of the people walking on the streets. People were walking as if they're walking through the mud. As if they would be buried if they were to stand still. They keep their feet moving. She had embodied feelings into the act of walking. People were struggling and urgent in their steps. They seemed like they couldn't stop walking from fear of something. It might have been subtle, but it had a large impact. There were times when a single sentence was capable of contributing to the entire book. There were definitely flaws in places, but she'd learned to work with them in no time. It would be another strength of hers. Her composition was quite artistic. He was easily able to picture her as a writer in the future. In midst of being impressed, he suddenly felt curious. Who won an award for the essay contest, he asked himself. Sun Hua had won the award. Judging from the writing itself, it wouldn't have been weird if Bomb had won. Had she been nervous? Being Boem, it would have been likely. For some reason, something was telling him that Sun Hua hadn't won because Boem had been nervous. At that moment, he heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Man, I'm so tired. Why is our teacher making us do all of the work? We have a director for that. It's because you're too good at it, Boem said. The door opened. Oh. Hey, Juho. Hey, you're late. Our teacher made us run some errands. Juho was sitting against the window. The notebooks and the papers were back in their places on the desk. Without suspecting, the two sat on their seats. The wind blew into the room. Unlike earlier, this time it felt lukewarm. Why are you just standing there? Don't block the window. Come sit. Don't mind if I do. He casually exchanged words with them. Sun Hua took out her comic book while Boem took out her snacks. Already, Juho started observing them in a different light than from a moment before. What would you do if the world came to an end tomorrow? Mr. Moon asked. It was a common question. I want to plant an apple tree, Sun Hua answered. For many Koreans, apple trees were among the first things that came to mind when thinking about the end of the world. Baruch Spinoza had quite an impact even to this day. It doesn't take that long to plant a tree. What are you going to do afterwards? Mr. Moon asked. I'm not sure. That's right, he nodded at Seo Kwang's murmur. Today, we're going to take some time to plan for the day this world comes to an end. Wouldn't it make today the most depressing day knowing the world as we know it would come to an end tomorrow? Would you be able to think of how you were going to spend your time? I do kind of feel helpless. Seo Kwang thought of a dystopian movie he had seen recently. Everyone had lost their minds with the incoming apocalypse. In that situation, would anyone be able to carry out the plan they'd come up with previously? Even if we come up with a plan now, would we be able to carry it out then? Who said anything about carrying it out? I don't expect you to. Well, if you came up with a plan, you gotta carry it out, right? Mr. Moon asked after Sun Wa's exemplary response, do you think the day before the end of the world will come in your time? It's always possible. Sun Wa hadn't really meant what she said either. She scrunched her forehead, and Juho snickered. Everyone had the same thought, then, what's the point of planning? This plan is for the present, Mr. Moon said calmly. The present. Yes. Even if the world is coming to an end, you gotta survive the present. You should plan while you're still around, right? What you want to do, and who you want to do that with. A plan for the present. If the world is coming to an end tomorrow, what would I do? What would I want to do on the very last day? Nobody knew when that day would come. That was what death was like. Juho thought about what he had to do that day if he were to die the next day. Mr. Moon suggested a more detailed situation, you see it in the morning news. It's telling you not to go to school. That's actually kind of nice. Everyone nodded in agreement at Seo Kwang's response. Among them, Mr. Moon was also included. It was exciting to think about not having to come to school. It sure is. Imagine the anchor says these words with a shaky voice. Tomorrow, this planet, our home full of life, will be coming to an end. Just now, it was made official by the most influential, powerful, and global organization. The government is yet to make a statement, and people are in chaos. Dear viewers, today marks the last day of the Earth. The last day on Earth, while that day was bound to come, it almost felt like it was right around the corner. Chapter 45. A Flower Yet to Bloom, 1, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 45, A Flower Yet to Bloom, 1, translated by Sean Su, edited by Sudiaol. As soon as Mr. Moon finished talking, the students picked up their pens and drew a big circle on their paper, ignoring the squares of the graph dot-like paper. At that moment, the circle was empty. What time are you planning on planting the apple tree? As if unable to think of a time, Seo Kwang asked Sun Wa. She gave him a genuine, serious response, I want to plant it right after I see the news. I should do something to calm myself down, like planting a tree. Maybe I should read. Whose book do I read? Are there going to be more classics by then? Yeah, probably. Seo Kwang had made an obvious choice. He looked like he was looking more to the new books in the future rather than the apocalypse itself. What about you, Baron? Juho asked. He too was drawing a neat circle on his sketchbook. He was truly an artist. I'll probably live just like any other day. Is that so? Just like any other day, it didn't sound like a bad idea. Well, I did think about running around the neighborhood but naked. Whoa. That was bold of him. Heck, it's the last day on Earth. What couldn't they do? Seo Kwang enthusiastically agreed with Baron, I'm sure a single lap around the neighborhood would be acceptable. If you're near my place, I'll treat you with some beverage. I'll remember that if I get thirsty. Do you keep a tab though? I think I'd look odd carrying a wallet when I'm naked. If you're arguing about something being weird, that was already over the moment you said naked, Juho thought. It'll be free of charge, of course. Great. I'll be there. Seo Kwang drew a line across the center of his circle and added, treat Baron to a beverage. He had already set a time, midday, without even getting Baron's opinion. What are you planning on doing? He asked as Juho looked at his planning chart. I'm probably going to be writing, presumably, he murmured nonchalantly. I wonder what would come out in the face of death, he thought to himself. Okay. You go ahead and write. If you finish, you have to come show it to me. You have to. Promise. What's wrong with you, man? You're making me uncomfortable. His words were like those of a predator that was pouncing on a prey, so Juho turned around from Seo Kwang's uncomfortable enthusiasm. He paid no attention to Juho and kept on blabbering things like, I have to read your work before I die. I'm more curious about what you'd write than any other author. His words were quite overbearing. Okay. Juho gave up trying to be serious. He couldn't ignore such a passionate reader, so he decided to keep things simple. Eat. Take a walk. Write about the last day. Seriously, what's with all the fuss? You need to see someone for that addiction of yours. If my love for print is a sickness, I refuse to treat it for the rest of my life. Sunhwa was also organizing her chart to find time for her comics. In Juho's eyes, there was hardly a difference between the two. Do you want to read comics together? Bom asked Sunhwa as she watched her working on her chart. Sure. You should come over. We'll plant a tree together. We'll probably get hungry afterwards, so I'll bring us lunch. They almost sounded like they were going on a picnic. How innocent, Juho thought with a smile. A picnic on the last day. That doesn't sound too bad. Our chart looks exactly the same. Ha! Their charts looked identical from the layout to their bedtimes to when they'd wake up in the morning. Whenever Sunhwa wrote something down, Bom did the same on her chart. Am I being too sensitive? Juho thought for a moment. It could be that I didn't approach the subject of the apocalypse very seriously. They're making plans to hang out and going over to each other's house, like it's a joke. It's nothing out of the blue, but still. What are you guys planning on doing together for the rest of the day? Ha! Bom, is there anything you want to do? He asked with his usual tone of voice. After a brief thought, she answered with an awkward smile, I'm not too sure. Is that right? Yeah. Maybe it's because it doesn't feel real to me. Then, Bom changed the subject somewhat forcefully, how about you, Juho? What are you going to do? She turned her eyes to his paper. For some time, there had been something that had bothered Juho. He had been noticing a sense of incompatibility in Sunhwa and Bom's friendship and had become curious. The past memories rushed through his head. The essay contest. The sprint race, Bom didn't get ahead of Sunhwa. It was especially apparent when she was presenting her results during writing lessons. He had seen their identical notebooks and the similar self-introductions that were written inside them. He thought of the time when the club members had been to the school library together. That was when he noticed something strange. Before choosing her book, Bom had asked Sunhwa, what do you think it'd be a better choice between these two books? Now, he was certain. Bom was dependent on Sunhwa. Okay, it's time to make a choice, Mr. Moon said to the students as they munched on chips. What are we choosing? They asked each other with their mouths full. An essay contest hosted outside of school, he explained briefly. Juho looked at pieces of paper next to the chalkboard. They were filled with information Mr. Moon had been collecting so far. Newspaper companies, publishing companies, universities, cultural foundations, literature associations. There were countless places hosting a contest. There's also a competition for special recognition, so choose carefully. It's up to you to decide which contest you want to be part of. Winning an award at a special recognition competition was a huge boost to college applications. As the name of the contest suggested, it meant that the winner was going to be recognized for his special skill in literature. It was a competition many wanted to win desperately. Can we not be part of one? Seo Kwang asked light-heartedly. The others, who were walking toward the board to get a better look at the papers, stopped and looked at him. Mr. Moon nodded, your choice. No one's going to give you a hard time. He met his eyes with everyone else in the room. Same goes for everyone else here. Decide for yourselves. Being a teacher is overrated. You can't live another person's life on their behalf. If you have something you don't want to do, all you have to do is say it, like Baron. Baron shrugged with the sketchbook in his hand. So, if there's something you want to do, go for it, even if you have the slightest of desires. I may not look or sound like one, but I am a teacher. I wouldn't put you all in harm's way. Juho looked at the papers hanging on the wall. They were from a high school amateur competition. He hesitated. Can I be part of that? What if people find out who I am? Wouldn't I get in people's way? Maybe I shouldn't compete. I did want to take part in a competition once. Amid the chaos in his head, those words jumped out of his mouth before he could do anything about it. Mr. Moon answered, then choose. Come find me when you've made a decision. With those parting words, he walked out of the science room. In the middle of the heavy atmosphere, Juho walked up to the front. Youth Literary Award, National Essay Contest Award, Literature Competition, National High School Essay Contest. There are a lot. Despite the number, every contest had something in common. Qualification. High school student. He brushed his smooth hands together, thinking about how they had been wrinkled before, when he drank. Now, he too met the qualification. What are you going to choose? Bom asked from the side. Sunhwa was also looking at the details of the contests from the other side. She had to have decided to take part in one. He stared at her face. She relied on others. Others were an essential existence to her. She avoided doing anything that would put her on someone's bad side. For that reason, she didn't try to prove herself to be superior than others. I'm not sure yet. It was a sensitive issue, and he decided to observe more. Like Mr. Moon had said, he couldn't live her life for her after all. I've made up my mind. Sunhwa said confidently as she grabbed one of the papers. She had chosen a competition hosted by a renowned four-year university. National High School Essay Contest. Are you aiming for the special recognition? It was like her. She'd always been an exemplary student. Win an award, and then get into a university. It's like catching two birds with one stone. I can't miss this. It won't be easy. Kids who compete in that train relentlessly at private institutes, Seo Kwang said. The name of the competition itself gave off a strong impression. There was no way around it. Yet, Sunhwa stood her ground. You might as well shoot for the stars. I kind of want to experience it for myself too. I made up my mind. Bom, do you want join? While she was looking at one of the papers, she nodded. At that moment, her eyes moved to another spot and stopped at the literature essay contest, something different from Sunhwa's choice. Weren't you thinking about choosing another competition? Juho asked her quietly. Huh? Oh, not really. I think it'd be nice to have Sunhwa around. I don't think I'll be as nervous either, she answered with a smile. As he looked at her, he heard a small voice sound from behind him and turned around. I'm going after the prize. Oh, $1,000 in cash. It was Seo Kwang. He had a piece of paper in his hand. I thought you didn't want to take part in any of them, Juho said. Everyone else is, so I felt kind of awkward backing out on my own. Do you even want to? Meh, I'm not sure. Sometimes, I can't figure out my own heart. Juho nodded. Nobody knew for certain. A person's heart was quite a pain in the neck. What's the hurry? Juho asked. After thinking on it briefly, Seo Kwang scratched his head and jokingly changed the subject. Come on. It's $1,000. Who wouldn't want that? If I win, I'll take you out. Everyone turned their attention to Seo Kwang after his exaggerated remark. Without saying much, Juho moved aside. He had no intention to force a conversation. There's a prize. Yep, $1,000. I want fried chicken. Me too. Sunhwa and Bom had already thought of what they wanted. Pizza for me, Baron said, having sat quietly all this time. He'd never miss an opportunity like that. Juho told everyone in a low voice, you guys might not want to celebrate too soon. At least we have something to celebrate, Sun Hwa said. Then, she remembered something she'd been meaning to ask, what about you, Baron? Are you planning on taking part in a competition? You're the sole artist in the literature club after all. Of course I am, Baron answered nonchalantly. Then, he took out a piece of paper he had been keeping to himself. Mr. Moon wouldn't leave me out. These are the details for the sketching competition. Wow, when is it? Can we go cheer for ya? Forget it. You'll distract me, he turned down the offer at once. As he watched the club restored to its boisterous atmosphere, Juho turned his eyes to the youth literary essay contest. It was relatively unpopular. Should I go with this one? The next day, he ran through the park early in the morning. It had become part of his daily routine to enjoy a beverage when he reached the rest area. As he quenched his thirst, he saw Sung Pil sitting straight on the bench. His thick eyebrows looked even darker, probably because he was sitting in the shade. Chapter 46. A Flower Yet to Bloom, 2, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 46, A Flower Yet to Bloom, 2, translated by Sean Su, edited by Sudiao. So, you are still not making any friends? Juho asked. Sung Pil was quite a straight edge, which was unusual for his age. Without any change in his expression, he admitted the fact that he was alone. Nope. Aren't you bored? At once, Sung Pil shook his head. He wasn't bored, apparently. I write. That's more than enough. Even within a boisterous class, he wrote by himself. Somehow, Juho saw a resemblance to his old self. He too had been alone at one point. That was when he had written The Trace of a Bird. He looked at Sung Pil. His real name was Pil Sung Choi. 3 years from then, he would accomplish his impressive debut. When did he write his debut novel? Juho wondered. Have you been working on anything lately? Sung Pil asked the head of Juho. He answered after thinking briefly, nothing unusual. I see. Instead. Sung Pil asked. I'm taking part in an essay contest with the club. An essay contest. His thick eyebrows furrowed. Yep. The Youth Literary Essay Contest. What's that? Can anybody take part in it? He seemed quite interested, and Juho told him everything he knew about the contest. I've heard you need a letter of recommendation from a teacher, but other than that, the only qualification is that you have to be a high school student. Then, he added, there's a preliminary round too. A preliminary round. What's that look like? It's like submitting your entry. You write about a topic of your choosing. After writing a short prose, you revise it to the set format and then upload it. Whoever gets picked gets to go up to the finals. I heard they give out the subject the day of. That sounds fun. His voice was filled with interest, and Juho said, you should give it a try. Should I? He asked back immediately. His heart was already more than willing. After suddenly standing up from his seat, Sung Pil told Juho, we'll meet at the finals. He hadn't even applied yet. If the judges like what I wrote. No. We can make it happen if we work hard enough. We'll meet at the finals, he emphasized again. Although it was just before sunrise, his face was already shining brightly. Juho chuckled with a sigh. Fine, if it's possible. There was 1 week left until the deadline for applications, and Juho was sitting in front of his computer. A topic of my choosing, huh? He couldn't resist the yawn forcing its way out. He felt sluggish and was not in a mood to write. There was 1 week left. He thought about starting back the next day, but soon, he shook his head. There was no guarantee that he'd be more motivated then, so it'd be safer to upload it when he could. He would have looked for another competition if he had been on his own, but now that Sung Pil was involved, Juho had to keep his end of the deal. A topic of my choosing. The topic was the contestant's choice, which meant that they'd accept just about anything. Juho applauded their generosity. I have to get past the preliminary round somehow. There was no time to lose. There were countless kids who had paid a handsome amount of money for detailed analyses of the past year's winning composition. However, it was hard to say that the youth literary essay contest would be more popular than Seo Kwang's or Sun Hwa's. That still doesn't mean that the competition will be taken over by those private institutes either. There was no right answer in literature. Analyzing an award. Winning work didn't always lead to winning an award. A high school literature contest was different from the professional world. What the critics were looking for the most was probably writing honestly, heartfelt, unpretentious, honest compositions that made them continue reading despite the crude sentence structures. For example, a mother's letter was one of those things because there were emotions behind those words. They were heartfelt. Before sincerity, even the most skillfully written sentence became mere pretense. Writing with sincerity might be something that was easier for those with less writing experience. At least, I prefer sincerity. In writing, he'd much rather prefer sincerity over skill. Sincerity. He immediately thought of someone. He was loud and had thick eyebrows. When he came across a 10-cent coin on the street, he didn't hesitate to take it to the police station. And he was not afraid to admit that he was alone. Let's do this. He thought about writing about Sung Pil and grabbed a piece of paper that was rolling around the room and picked up a pen. First, he had to give shape to the ideas floating around in his head. Sung Pil and thick eyebrows would not be necessary. He's alone. He writes. He's honest. His writing. His future, present and past. Freedom. Police station. Race. Sincerity. There was no way he could include all those thoughts. The length of the composition was limited. In that case, a core foundation had to be established. He had to pick out the most memorable parts of the story. The past of a person who had succeeded. That was not a failure. It was a leap toward success. He thought about Sung Pil's present. He writes by himself in a classroom full of kids. In that place, he was alone. Is this going to turn into my story? He reminisced about his past and revisited memories that were more than 30 years old. He had been alone. He couldn't figure why that was. A person always became alone at some point. There was no seat for him anywhere. With his tightened lips, he listened to the sounds coming from the classroom. One by one, he wrote out his honest feelings, advancing towards something, at least for the duration of his writing. Just like that, the trace of a bird was born. He overlaid his memories with another person's appearance. Then, he closed his eyes and pictured Sung Pil looking more mature, but slowly getting younger. This should do. He put his hands over the keyboard. Tick. Tick. For a while, there was nothing but the sound of the pressed keys. An author looking back to his first writing. Calmly, Juho wrote out his story. Did you apply? Bom asked, and Juho nodded with a piece of cookie in his mouth. Of course he had. Your competition, the Youth Literary Essay Contest, is happening first, right? Sun Hwa asked while bringing some cookie crumbs to her mouth. I think so. Every contest started on a different date. In terms of order, Juho's was first. Will I make it to the finals? I'm sure you will. Crunch. Seo Kwang had answered while chewing on his chip, and Juho added with a shrug, you don't know that. No, I'm confident you will. You sound way too confident. What if I don't? As Juho said that with a smile, Sun Hwa shouted, hey. Don't you say stuff like that. Yeah. You'll make it. Bom added, smiling. If you did a good job, you'll be fine, Baron said indifferently. You gotta start us off on a good note. So that we can ride the wave. Have a refreshing start. Sun Hua, Baron, and Xiao Kuang said in order. Although hiding behind their presumably encouraging words, their true meaning was obvious. Baum smiled awkwardly. I'm moved to tears from all of your support. Buzz. As soon as Juho finished, a phone rang. The five immediately turned their eyes to the same place, and Juho slowly reached for his phone. He checked the screen. It's from the essay contest. There was a still silence, and yet, apparent clamoring. In that moment, only Juho was calm. Hurry. Read it. I'm sure it's good news. Goodness. I don't know why I'm getting so nervous. You should be too. Hurry up and read it. Sun Hua, Bom, Xiao Kuang, and Baron rushed him in order, and he calmly checked the message on his phone. Congratulations. You have been chosen as one of the finalists. The science room was filled with cheers. Juho was at a subway station. He was about 10 minutes early to the appointment, so he walked into a nearby convenience store and bought a drink. When he walked out of the store, as he opened his bottle, he saw Sung Pil standing there, looking around. You're early. He turned around at the sound of Juho's voice. Here we are, going to the finals. He had a satisfied look on his face. That day was the day when the finals were taking place. His thick eyebrows moved up and down with joy. Seriously, what luck. You mean skill. It was a rare talent to be able to make such arrogant remarks while maintaining such a modest appearance. Sung Pil urged him on, we should get going. We don't want to be late. Yep. There was plenty of time, but Juho followed him without arguing. The two got on the subway. What do you think the topic will be? Sung Pil asked with a slightly excited voice. It was apparent that he was looking forward to the contest. I'm not sure. It could be anything really. It could be this subway train we're on. There was no way to know when they hadn't even arrived at the conference hall, so Juho just thought out loud. The subway. I see. The subway. Juho immersed himself in thought, thinking of the place he had just been. It could be a convenience store. Convenience store, huh? Well, not likely. You never know. There's no way to know, but who knows? We might be lucky enough to guess, he thought. Then, he thought about the various topics that had come up within the literature club. Hunger. There was no telling whether a topic would be limited to an object or not. Hunger. Speaking of which, I'm kind of hungry. Did you have breakfast? He asked as he rubbed his belly. I had a quick bite, but I could probably eat a little more. Then, let's go grab some snacks. Sure. The two got off the train and made their way into a noodle shop. Now, let's go inside. Shall we? Yep. You said it's at a lecture hall, right? It's down that street over there, Sung Pil said while looking at the campus directory. Juho looked at the direction he was pointing. It was in a slight incline. As they walked toward the building in the distance, Sung Pil asked, what do you think? About what? Upon his question, Sung Pil answered while moving his eyebrows, should we race? A race. Is that really a wise decision before the contest? Juho looked at their destination. There was still a long way to go. While he was contemplating, Sung Pil readied himself. By then, there was no choice. Fine. It couldn't have taken that long. At Juho's answer, Sung Pil smiled as if he had been expecting him to agree to it, and they stood shoulder to shoulder before an invisible starting line. Should we make a bet? Just to make it more interesting. Sung Pil agreed, let's keep it basic. Loser buys ice cream. There was a store on the way, Juho answered as he thought of the store he had seen on their way there. As they got in position, Sung Pil gave out a signal, ready. Juho flexed his legs. Go! Sung Pil shouted. As soon as he heard the signal, Juho bolted from his place. He saw Sung Pil from the corner of his eyes. They were running forward at a nearly identical speed. Chapter 47. A Flower Yet to Bloom, 3, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 47. A Flower Yet to Bloom, 3, as soon as his torso moved forward, the footsteps followed. From the scenery to the various sounds, everything was a step behind him. Sung Pil was the only exception. He was running right beside him, and Juho smiled. So, you're not going down easy, huh? He started to run out of breath. Still, he felt much better than he had before. The building was near, and the door became visible, so the two thought simultaneously, whoever passes through that door is the winner. Although his legs were tired from running uphill, Juho pushed on. Sung Pil did the same. Here I come! Sung Pil shouted. They were getting close to the door, and Juho added with a smile, I can't let that happen. Then, he took his final step. With his hand on his side, he bent forward. It was harmful to sprint immediately after a meal, but he chuckled as he caught his breath, Ack. No. Victory. Sung Pil groaned in defeat. He too was gasping for breath. Running up a hill was twice as hard as on a flat surface. On top of that, they had covered quite a distance. Still. 29 total. 15 wins, 14 losses. Juho felt great. They occasionally raced each other, and the results so far had been 14-14 out of 20.8. It didn't feel bad at all to be adding another victory to the record. I could have caught up. That's a shame. Sung Pil clenched his fist at Juho's calm attitude. The other contestants stared at the two as they walked into the building. The tension in the air had been alleviated by their race. Paying no attention to the people looking at him, Juho looked around. The lecture hall was on the first floor. That's where he was going to be writing. He left Sung Pil writhing in defeat and asked a college student who was working as a guide for information, we're not late, are we? No. There's still plenty of time. After checking the time, Juho told Sung Pil, take all the time you want. There's plenty of time. There's always a next time, Sung Pil said as he sprung up and brushed down his sides with his hands. It really wasn't a good idea to sprint right after a meal. While drawing people's attention, they walked confidently into the lecture hall. There are so many desks here, Sung Pil said the first impression he got from the hall, and like he had said, there was a large number of desks. The hall was full of them, each capable of seating at least 4. There were empty seats here and there. As Juho found a seat in the backmost desk, Sung Pil sat himself in the row ahead. He was visible whenever Juho turned his head diagonally to the right. There was a large screen in the front of the hall, and the Youth Literary Essay Contest was written in large letters. Underneath it was the time for the beginning and the end of the contest. 2 hours. It was plenty. I wonder what the topic is going to be. They're not going to make us play word chain all of a sudden like Mr. Moon, are they? You, sir, tell me the first word that comes to your mind. Whoever that would be, would panic. As Juho occupied himself with random thoughts, somebody walked up to the podium. He introduced himself as a professor of creative literature and explained the schedule of the contest. Then, he talked about the following school orientation and lecture that would be given by an author who had also been invited to be one of the judges of the contest. At that moment, a sound came from behind everyone, and he walked in bent over at the waist. He was late, but the professor didn't try to punish the contestant. For the most part, they seemed to be gracious toward people who were slightly late. It wasn't such a strict contest after all. I will now present to you the topic of today's contest. The moment everyone had been waiting for. The topic marked the beginning of the contest. The entire lecture hall stood still. There was an odd tension in the air. The professor took out a small piece of paper and then added, winter, beach, and days. Please choose one. You may begin. As soon as he finished, the 3 words popped up on the screen. Winter, beach, and days. Some kids started writing as soon as they received their papers, whereas others took more time to think. None of the words Juho had guessed in the subway were there. I guess that's obvious, he thought. What to pick? The only 2 that his mind was attracted to were days and beach. Days. Time coexists with space. Days spent in a certain place. He thought about the conversation he'd had with Sung Pil on the subway ride to the campus, subway, convenience store. I'm more drawn to beach. I've written about a subway before. He thought about the beach. The weather at the beach tends to be unpredictable. Waves break. It's sunny for a moment, and then the rain starts to pour down the moment after. It's a cloudy sky. After a peaceful time, a storm is bound to follow. As he put down the paper onto the desk, he closed his eyes and imagined the storm. The girl who lived at the beach knew all about the storm that followed at the end of peace. The sky changed. Clouds changed their shapes. The air and the temperature felt different. Everything changed from how they had been when things were peaceful. The wind carried plenty of dust. The dust piled up in people's hearts, breeding anxiety and impatience. Juho picked up his pen. Ah! His arm brushed up against another person. The student who sat next to him looked at his arm, but soon turned his eyes back to his own paper. I forgot that I was sharing the desk with 3 other people, he thought as he lowered his eyes. The pens and pieces of paper were enough to fill the desk. His eyes followed down the desk. Paper, pencil, hand, paper, pencil, hand, cock.a. Doodle. A rooster crowed in his head. Is this what it's like to live as a chicken in a farm? It almost felt like he was stuck in a word factory. This is frustrating. He put down his pen and looked around the hall. There were many hands busy, writing. The professor had been long gone, but a few of the administrators were standing around. He looked diagonally from him, and with a serious face, Sung Pil was steadily filling out his paper. His thick eyebrows were slightly furrowed, a sign of concentration. He was doing well, but he too was about to brush up against the person sitting next to him. There wasn't a lot of space, and Juho felt constrained. In the end, he stood up from his seat. I need some fresh air. He randomly chose one of the people standing and asked for permission to step out. In a friendly manner, the person showed him the way to the restroom. Sigh. Juho went the opposite direction from the restroom and pushed open the door made of glass. The outside air rushed in, but it didn't feel all that refreshing. He breathed slowly while leaning against the door. A building was blocking his sight, so he moved his eyes up to the sky. For some reason, the sky felt lower than usual. What if I can't write anything? It was suffocating to even think about going back into the lecture hall. A storm. He imagined a gust of wind sweeping across the hall. It'd make things a bit more refreshing, he thought. Haha. Of course, that wasn't going to happen. Excuse me, what are you doing here? He turned back at the sudden sound of a person's voice. A man with a friendly face was standing there. He looked to be in his mid-30s, and as Juho stood straight, the man asked again, "Is there a problem?" He sounded friendly, and Juho knew who that man was, Professor Bong. "Ha, do you know me? You're famous." "It'd be nice if I were," he answered with a gentle smile. It was not a sign of modesty by any means. Then, Juho realized that what he had said hadn't happened yet. Jun Su Bong. This is before he becomes known. So, Juho added to settle the matter, "I'm a fan. I've been enjoying your work quite a bit." "Thanks. I didn't know I'd have such a young fan. Although he was an excellent writer, his work didn't appeal to the masses. From a livelihood and author perspective, absence of such appeal was fatal. Yet, he refused to change his style. Then, he became famous. Juho stared intently into his face. He had heard that he used to teach as a professor before committing to writing full-time. The professor from the lecture hall had mentioned something about a lecture. Could he the speaker? At that moment, he remembered that he had forgotten to answer the professor's question. I came out for some fresh air. You're taking part in the essay contest, right? I saw you back there. You were the only person looking up. Did he catch me getting distracted? Juho thought as he laughed awkwardly. Jun-soo waved at that. Oh, I didn't mean anything bad. I just thought that you knew the value of knowing your surroundings. I see. Thank you. Jun-soo nodded with a smile, a naive kind of smile, and Juho would have never guessed that he'd be meeting him here. Are you here as a judge? Yes, embarrassingly. Embarrassing. He was cautious about judging other people's writing. However, Juho accepted it. An amateur wouldn't recognize a master, but a master tended to recognize an amateur at once. In the same way, the writer's skill level became apparent even after reading for a brief moment. I didn't think I'd meet such a big name writer at a contest I signed up for whimsically. Juho wasn't sure of what to do. Then, I presume that you've read my book. Sure, he answered with a smile. How would he judge his own writing? Before that, will I even be able to write anything for the contest? Juho thought. Buzz. At that moment, Jun-soo's phone rang. After checking the caller's name, he added, it's my teacher. If you're a fan, you'd know who, right? Yun-seo Beck. Jun-soo smiled bright at the sound of her name. Again, it was a naive kind of smile. You really are a fan. I appreciate that. Well, good luck, and make yourself at home. Yes, sir. He walked out through the door Juho was leaning against. His teacher. He had been referring to an author named Yun-seo Beck. Well into her 50s, she took in pupils in order to train authors for the coming generation. Among her pupils, there were quite a few who were famous. She also happens to be friends with Hyun-do Lim. She had announced her last work at the age of 60. It was about her husband, Hyun-do Lim, and the reminiscing of her past. What are you doing? It was the person who had showed Juho to the restroom, and he added as he called for him, there's not a lot of time left. I'm coming. Juho rushed back. He sat down once he came back into the hall. It wasn't like he was going to have more space because he had been gone for a few minutes. He looked to his sides. There were contestants busy writing. With serious faces, they each wrote down their own, unique stories. How many of these students would actually grow up to be an author? How many of these students would actually dream about their childhood? Sadly, most of them would probably fail. There was no guarantee, whatsoever, that they would achieve their dreams in life. He was aware that it also applied just as much to him. No matter how talented or how hard one tried, failure was always near. Some stayed completely still out of fear. Some kept moving despite it. Some carefully calculate their next step. There were many ways to deal with failure, and none of those were wrong answers. Humans were bound to experience failure regardless. Well, maybe not him. Chapter 48. A Flower Yet to Bloom, 4, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 48. A Flower Yet to Bloom, 4, Pil Sung Choi, in the future, he would become a best-selling author under the name of Sung Pil. He was a flower yet to bloom, and his potential was yet to be fully realized. Juho looked forward to the countless books he would be putting out in the future, and even more so to the moment when that bud bloomed into a beautiful flower in their cruel world. He saw Sung Pil's back from behind. The people sitting beside him were leaning forward just like him. Everyone had their heads down with their eyes focused on their paper. Only those who could dare to straighten their backs in that place were given the rights to escape and move up to a higher place. Would Sung Pil dare to take the chance? As Juho's thoughts meandered, Sung Pil suddenly looked up and glanced over at Juho. Their eyes met. Juho was somewhat surprised by him. He was mouthing some words, and Juho looked carefully to try to figure out what he was trying to say. Hurry up and get back to work. Juho chuckled quietly at his concern. With his thick eyebrows twitching, he turned around and faced forward. He didn't quite blend with such a serious atmosphere. Amid anxious, impatient people, he was the only person who was excited. Perhaps that was how he would be able to soar to the sky as a writer. I want to write about him. The girl who lived at the beach was no longer. Only the thick eyebrows remained in Juho's mind. He wanted to see the sight of Sung Pil facing the storm. He wanted to know how to face the storm. He checked the time. There was about an hour left to the competition. He mapped out a story in his head, and there wasn't enough time to write everything he wanted to. The format of his story didn't quite fit the occasion, but it was a story he could finish in a couple of hours. Well, I gotta follow what my heart desires, he reminded himself as he picked up his pen. As he was busied himself writing, his hand again made contact with the person next to him. Just like previously, he briefly glanced over without saying anything. He stopped writing, looked in her direction and whispered, "Sorry." He apologized first. She seemed flustered, but soon after she lowered her head. Juho smiled, feeling relieved. Like everyone else in the hall, Juho moved his hands busily. He was rushing slightly. Even as he recognized the urgency in his heart, he kept on writing. There was no time, so it made sense that he was feeling that way. It was nothing unexpected. What was more important in that moment was to maintain a rational mindset. One shouldn't be carried away by the urgency in his own heart and make the mistake of letting his hand take over. The wise thing to do was to write with rationale. There wasn't much meaning to a composition that had been rushed into completion because the writer had been in a hurry. His hand no longer reeked with alcohol, and he knew he was capable, so he tightened his grip around his pen. Now, please bring your submissions to the front, a voice informed the end of the competition. Then, Juho looked up. The creative literature professor was at the podium. Is it over? He put down his pen. His hand was glowing bright red. Sounds that had grown distant slowly made their way back. The lecture hall was getting noisy. Some looked relieved whereas others looked sad. While massaging his hand, Juho slowly stood up from his seat and walked toward the podium. When he walked outside after submitting his paper, Sung Pil was there. As soon as he saw Juho, he walked over to him and asked, "How'd you do?" So. I feel pretty confident." "What did you write about?" "The beach." "I see. I went with days." He had just answered Juho's next question without even being asked, and Juho nodded. Days, huh? He was curious about what kind of story might have come out, but he wouldn't be able to read it now that it had been submitted. As he watched the other contestants lingering outside, Juho asked Sung Pil, "I think there's a school orientation now. I'm thinking about heading back." "What are you going to do? You're not going to stick around." "Can we do that?" "It's up to the person." Sung Pil took a moment to think and said, It's still part of the schedule. I think I better stick around." I knew it. He had a diligent character and he wanted to stay for the entirety of the program. Juho nodded. "Well, I'll see you tomorrow morning. I'll buy the ice cream tomorrow." Juho remembered their bet from earlier and chuckled. He could have let it slide. Without saying any more, the two parted ways. Juho walked back to the subway station on his own, thinking, as he walked down the darkening street, what was my answer to his question when he asked how I did. So maybe, I could have done better. Bitter, he kept walking. Jun-soo looked at the pile of papers before his eyes. Other judges like Professor Choi, Professor Han, and Professor Byung, were also reading something. I guess it's too soon to expect the next Yun-woo, Professor Choi murmured as he put down what he had been reading. There was regret in his tone. Jun-soo answered, if these kids wrote like Yun-woo, I wouldn't be able to keep my job. Haha. You've got nothing to worry about, Mr. Bong. Everyone knows about your skills. It'd be nice if that was true, Jun-soo answered to Professor Byung with a chuckle. There are still some who did well. Look at this one. Professor Byung handed Jun-soo one of the submissions. Topic. Days. Name. Pil Sung Choi. After reading through it, he nodded, this is good. He used a convenience store as the space for expressing the time loop. Refreshing. I like his style. He's young, but it's got some weight to it. I think I'm going to be seeing him around as an author. Who wrote it? Take a look. He stretched as he handed over the paper to Professor Choi. He was tired from reading through and judging other people's writing. He found no joy in reading for the purpose of categorization. No matter how sloppy it was, a composition that embodied its writer's dreams made for an excellent work. Coming to think of it, what about that kid I ran into earlier? Since he didn't know his name, he couldn't look for his work. Then, he thought about the lecture, I didn't see him. He set aside his thoughts and continued reading through the piles of paper. Next up. This time, the paper was on The Beach, by Juho Woo. That's a unique name. What should we do for dinner afterwards? Let's go for a drink nearby, shall we? We still have a lot of work to do. While working quietly, Professor Han responded with a gentle voice. The two other professors laughed it off and then went back to reading. You look so serious, Mr. Bong. What are you reading? Professor Han asked while looking at him. Jun-soo didn't respond. Professor Choi, who was sitting next to him, called for him again, Mr. Bong. Yes. Still, Jun-soo looked up in a delayed response. At that, Professor Choi took the paper from his hand. What is it that's mesmerizing you? With a cringe, he added after taking the paper from him, this is incomplete. It should be disqualified. He put the paper down without even reading it carefully. Of course. This is a competition, Jun-soo said as he kept his eyes fixed on the paper. It was a competition. There was no award for unfinished work. Yet. I don't think I'd like anything else in here anymore. Juho stared into the ceiling as he lay on his bed. He was regretting his performance at the competition. There wasn't enough time. He had been ambitious. He had known that he was cutting too close. He had been aware that he might not be able to finish it in time. I didn't think I'd actually not finish. He thought he would have been able to pull it off. He didn't feel angry or sad. Only, the regret lingered at the end of his fingertips. Sung Pil. He had done it. He reminisced about the past. It had been about a week since the competition, and as usual, he had met up with Sung Pil for his morning exercise. His thick eyebrows had seemed like they were sitting higher than usual. I got the award, he had said with a slightly stiff voice. While he had been stretching, Juho had looked up at him. He had been looking down with anticipation and concern. Ha ha ha. At the sight of his stiff, peculiar expression, he couldn't help but laugh. Flustered, Sung Pil had asked seriously, why are you laughing? You should have seen the look on your face. That'd be difficult since I don't have a mirror on me at the moment. Juho hadn't been surprised by the news. He'd had a feeling that Sung Pil might win. Congratulations. After laughing for a good while, he had sincerely congratulated his friend. Sung Pil had smiled joyfully. He had won an award in his first essay competition. He definitely had potential. He lost the race that day, too. Juho got up from his bed. Rustle. Dozens of pages made a rustling sound whenever he moved on the mattress. It was the remainder of the story that he hadn't had the time for. After facing the storm, the man became even stronger. Would things have been different at all if I had actually finished? Or would Sung Pil have won still? Although, I'm not particularly crazy about the award. His only regret was not being able to compete with Sung Pil's story. Whose work would have moved the hearts of the judges more? Well, I didn't even make it to the end, so what can I do? An incomplete work was not read by the judges. It was a competition after all. The moment he had submitted his work, no, the moment the bell had rang, Juho had known all along. I felt confident for once. For once, he had actually felt the desire to write, to beat Sung Pil, and to write about him. Well, no use in crying over spilled milk. Desiring a change of environment, he decided to go for a walk. He stepped on the floor, and there were papers scattered throughout even that. He walked toward the door, stepping over many pages. The sun feels hot today. He put his hand over his eyes at the sudden sunshine and felt the parts of his body exposed to the sun getting warmer. He walked aimlessly. When did I start going on walks? He tried to retrace his memories. At first, he didn't like to wander around outdoors. That changed when he started writing. Since then, he intentionally went out whenever there was time. It could have been that being an author involved going out and looking for things. He walked into a residential area. There were many hills because the entire neighborhood was on the mountains. From time to time, he saw the mountain peeking through the alleyways and he went up and down several hills, growing sweatier. By the time he had lost count of the hills he had climbed and gone down from, he saw another hill before him. Without hesitating, Juho headed up. It's kind of steep. He moved slowly. The peak of the hill was pointing toward the sky. Then, he saw a person, a mother with a stroller with her baby inside. They must have come out for a walk too. He looked at the houses that were facing one another between the hills. He couldn't remember exactly from when, but it was definitely one of the older memories. It had been either really hot or really cold, but the only thing left in that fragment of memory was a voice. I heard it around here somewhere. The voice of a mother had come through the wall of the residential area. There had also been the sound of a baby crying. It had been weeping in sorrow while the mother shouted, "I'm so sick of this. I've had it." Had she been saying that to her baby? To that day, he didn't know what the mother was getting sick of. Only, he vividly remembered her voice echoing throughout the hills. As he wondered if he'd hear that voice again, he climbed the hill. After looking at the houses, he looked ahead. There was a stroller coming down the hill. A scream followed. Chapter 49. The sound of a crying baby. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 49. The sound of a crying baby. Somebody was shouting. Juho was looking at the stroller that was still coming down the hill. A stroller coming down a hill was not a problem in and of itself. However, this was different. A stroller was rushing down the hill on its own, away from someone. No one was holding the stroller's handlebar. No one was around the baby. The stroller was plunging down the hill, and with an ominous sound, it finally fell. Thud. It was hard to tell if the sound had come from the stroller or from his heart. Thud. The stroller that had been plunging down the hill toward Juho had suddenly changed its course toward the right. There was a wall there, and the stroller didn't seem sturdy enough to protect the baby from the cold concrete wall. I hear it. At that moment, he had heard the sound of the baby. It hadn't been the sound he remembered. The baby inside the stroller had been wailing. He saw the baby's red lips through the stroller's translucent cover. He had run towards it without hesitation, getting closer to the baby. However, he wasn't fast enough. He had to be faster or he wouldn't be able to save the baby. At that rate, the stroller would ram into the wall. The sound of the baby's wail distracted him. Who was screaming earlier? It was probably the mother, he thought. Her scream overlapped with the voice in his memory. I'm so sick of this. His heart was pounding. What if the baby gets killed? What if the stroller rams into that rock-solid wall? Get the stroller. He recognized the words that jumped out of his mouth. Get it. Who was he shouting to? He saw the baby's hands reaching towards the sky and leapt. He fell on his side, holding the stroller. Then, he felt a strong impact against his back. Gah! Wah! Wah! He felt dizzy and he was breathing raggedly. His heart was pounding, but he heard a cry. A cry. The baby's alive. The baby's not dead. He picked up the stroller. The baby was covered in a bundle of cloth, and there were no apparent injuries. My baby. The mother rushed down the hill toward the baby, who was still wailing. Juho leaned against the wall and collapsed. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, no. The stroller fell. You should go to the hospital to make sure the baby's okay. Yes, of course. Thank you. Goodness, I can't thank you enough. He heard her thanks from the distance. His ears were ringing. It almost felt like he was underwater, and he felt sluggish. When he snapped out of it, both the mother and the baby were gone, and he was standing on an empty hill by himself in a dazed state. I wonder if the baby's going to be okay. He looked at his hand. It was bleeding. The small wound was throbbing painfully. His palm started to heat up. It was slightly itchy and painful at the same time. Soon and slowly, he went on his way, his pace picking up gradually. I must write. His mind commanded him, you must write, now. He looked through his pockets, but there was nothing. No pen, nor paper. He looked around. There was no paper, anywhere. I have to write before this feeling fades away. He couldn't find the tools he needed and clenched his hands into fists. The wound was still throbbing. He ran through the hills with every bit of strength he had, up and down. Gasps of warm air came out of his mouth. I have to go write. I have to write out what I'm feeling. I have to start my story while this feeling is still fresh. I have to write it out while it's still raw, before I start trimming it with rationales. I have to embody this feeling in my writing. Ah! He tripped on a rock on the ground, but thankfully, he didn't fall. Juho restored his balance and continued running as fast as he could. Doing all of that just to write. He was running out of breath and he felt water going into his nose. The water that surrounded that world was going into his body. The screams of the mother were still lingering in his ears. The fear of death was still raw in his mind. The wailing of the baby was still haunting him. He finally arrived home and slammed the door open, taking his shoes off in a hurry and running into his room. Pencil, pen, it doesn't matter. Paper, paper, paper. Quickly, fast. Sigh. Juho swallowed anxiously. His mouth was dry. He needed to drink something. There was a water, a deep ocean, and he had to pull what he was looking for out of that. He had to dredge it out. It had to come up nearly to the surface. Mother, baby, wailing, distance, death, wall, scream, hills. It needs to be more specific. The mother looked young. She had a mole. 2 moles under her eye. She was red around her eyes and so were her eyes. Her hair was short, and she didn't wear any makeup. She was panting. Her chest was moving up and down. Her hands were shaking like her voice. She was wearing a navy blue shirt with blue jeans and sandals. Her lips were dry, and her tongue was red. More. What about the hill? There were 6 telephone poles. There were also red bricks, a gray wall and the asphalt. Residential area. It wouldn't have been weird if somebody had been watching. It wouldn't have been weird to take notice after hearing either the baby or the mother. It was exactly like how he remembered. He might not have been the only person who heard the scream. Of course, the people in that neighborhood probably heard it too, even if they had covered their ears. That sound. One can't simply ignore it because he or she doesn't want to hear it. It's not like eyes. The ears listen until the very end. A little more, just a little more. He moved his hand frantically. A trail of blood followed his pen. When she came home from work, she realized that all of the lights in the living room were switched off. Juho must be home by now. She walked in as she switched on the lights. "Son," she called for Juho. There was no response. Did he go somewhere? After moving the groceries to the kitchen, she looked around the living room. Then, she saw that the door to Juho's room was slightly ajar and heard him in his room. She opened the door. Oh my goodness. Juho was in his room. He had grown much more mature as of late and he was the genius author, the talk of the town. She had been glad at first, but as time went on, her concerns grew with his fame. Even after more than 40 years, there were still countless things to be learned. She wasn't sure of what to do. She didn't know what to tell her son as a person who led an ordinary life. Thankfully, her proud son had been doing well on his own. Now, he was trying to do something. As his mother, she was able to tell on instinct. Without even sitting on a chair, he was writing on his knees on the floor, surrounded by pages and pages of paper while pouring out his inspiration like water. Being careful not to make a sound, she backed out slowly. She wasn't sure of what he was up to, but of one thing she was certain: I can't disturb him. I can't disturb my son. Keep it up, son, she rooted quietly for him as she sat on a chair in the kitchen. Juho left for school, struggling to massage his burning back. In the morning, his mother had seen the scattered mess in his room and slapped him on the back. "Clean your room," she'd yelled. Yawn. On the hand covering his mouth, there was a bandage wrapped around it, and he was startled by the blood on his pen. His eyelids felt heavy from writing into the morning. Though it hadn't been refined, he tried moving around bits and pieces of his story. As a consequence of that, he was going to school with hardly any sleep and he might as well give up trying to stay awake for his classes. "I'm sorry, teachers." "Hey. What's with your face?" As he was passing through the gate, a voice called for him from behind. He turned around and saw Seo Kwang waving at him. He had asked, surprised by Juho's appearance. "I didn't get a lot of sleep last night." "My friend, need I remind you that sharing is caring?" Though Juho had already explained, Seo Kwang asked insistently. "What do you mean, where?" "We're at school." Like the vigorous youth they were boisterous from the morning, but Juho went to the class with his eyes closed halfway. "Hey, wake up." As expected, he'd slept through the morning classes. He raised his head at the sound of Seo Kwang's voice. It was hard to wake up. As he slowly bobbed his head up and down, Seo Kwang said, "Go wash your face or something. Make sure to tell me the website before you go. Being a student is exhausting." "What are you talking about? Nothing's easy in this world." Juho rubbed his face to force himself awake. His body felt stiff from leaning onto the desk all morning. Then, he stood up and opened the window, but the breeze wasn't cold enough to wake him up. "Let's go eat, I'm starving." "Yeah, I should eat." He stood up and asked, "Sunhwa and Bom are joining us for lunch, right? If you're late and get in trouble, I'm not going to take responsibility for your decisions." "Is it that late?" "Well, not enough to be scolded by Sunhwa." The two headed for the cafeteria and saw Sunhwa and Bom waiting for them in the distance. Just as Seo Kwang had said, Sunhwa didn't look very happy. Bom was next to her, busy trying to calm her down. You too. Why are you so late? Do you have any idea how important a meal is to a student? I'm not rushing here for no reason, you know. Don't look at me. We're late because somebody wouldn't wake up. Seo Kwang naturally shifted the blame onto Juho. It was true, however, so there wasn't much else to be said. Sun Hwa, we should go in before it gets late. Juho Woo, if they served something good for lunch today, you're a dead man, huh? Stop laughing. I'm trying to stay mad here. The four went into the cafeteria. Thankfully, the daily menu hadn't been very special, and there were plenty of seats since a good number of kids had already left. Lunch isn't very good today, Sun Hwa complained. Yeah, Bom agreed with her. At least there are some solid chunks in there, Juho thought as he looked at his bowl of soup. There were pieces of mushroom and tofu floating around. Thinking back to the time he had wandered about the soup kitchen, this was more than enough to be thankful for, so he put the food in his mouth without complaining. So why are you late? Sun Hwa asked. She seemed displeased for some reason. Maybe it's her lunch. But then, she would have had the same expression even if the lunch was delicious. I was having trouble waking up. What were you doing at night staying up? He thought about her question, how do I explain this? Juho had written throughout the night. He'd started writing because he'd ran into various sources of inspiration when he had gone out for a walk. He had gone for a walk because I didn't get the award, Juho answered as he reached for a side dish. He regretted not finishing his composition at the competition. Chapter 50. The first encounter. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 50. The first encounter. At Juho's ambivalence, Seo Kwang asked as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. What? Why? Who were the judges? Which competition were you part of again? You of all people though. You. Hey, man. There's no need to be so nosy. Well, it's just that. Of all people. Sun Hwa glared at him, and Juho explained while Seo Kwang still wore a puzzled look on his face, I just didn't have enough time. Then, he put the spoonful of food in his mouth. For some reason, nobody was talking. He picked up a piece of kimchi from the tray and brought it to his mouth. Crunch. Crunch. There was nothing but the sound of chewing for a while. Ha! Juho looked around at the prolonged silence. Sun Hwa was there with a slightly awkward look while Seo Kwang was still murmuring. Aha! Then, he understood the situation. I'm fine. Really. I did get something good out of it. Okay. For some reason, the response was still lukewarm. I can't think of a way to explain this. I'll just leave MB for now, he thought as he chewed his food. The next morning, he found a black plastic bag full of snacks on top of his desk. When he picked it up, he found a comic book underneath. The heroic story of a protagonist who overcomes the trials of his past. That's what was written on the back of the book. He started reading it, and it was actually not bad. Soon, Seo Kwang arrived. Instead of a bag full of something, he had brought a bag full of questions, and Juho answered them light-heartedly, saying, it's fine. I wrote the rest at home. I wasn't even interested in the award anyway. At that, Seo Kwang's eyes lit up, let me read it. I don't know where I put it. I'll find it. When are you free today? Can I come over? No. Not for a while. I have ideas for my next book in my room. If he sees it, he might find out that I'm Yun-woo. This guy's quick when it comes to reading and writing. He added as Seo Kwang was still in shock, I'll bring it to you later. You promise? Yep. After comforting Seo Kwang, he smiled as he looked at the comic book and the bag full of snacks. His friends were unstoppable. I should share this with the rest of the club members. Having read through the comic book between classes, he had a lively conversation about it with Sun Hua. He had to spend significantly more time listening to her, but nevertheless, it was a fun time. I'm home. Hey, I'm actually on my way out, so you'll have to eat dinner on your own. Don't forget the fruit. Okay. Be safe. When he got home, Juho changed out of his school uniform and sat himself in front of his desk with a cup of water. There were untidy stacks of paper to the side. He was somewhat afraid to reach for them. This is going to be hard to read. It's going to be all over the place. A composition written in the midst of an intense emotional experience was usually difficult to read later. Still, he had to choose. He had to pick out bits and pieces to knit it into a story. He had to reach for a lump of clay that barely held its shape. He had to cut and trip to make something out of it, whether it was a person or an animal. He leaned against the backrest and slowly relaxed his body, trying to replay the events in his head. There was a mother and her child. Daughter. Son. I can't know yet. A doll without any facial features came to mind. It was wearing a name tag that read, Mom. Juho approached her. The mother loses her grip on the stroller. The stroller rushes down the steep hill. When he saw that, he became curious about the expression on her face, so he turned around and looked at her. The woman without eyes, nose or mouth looked around as she recognized him staring at her. He tried to talk to her. Aren't you going to go after the stroller? The doll didn't respond. Your baby is in there. She still didn't respond. Only, her stomach was slightly bloated. She was breathing in. Your child is in danger. The cloth on the doll puffed up. Air was trying to escape. Your baby might die. Ah. The doll suddenly had a mouth but still no eyes or nose. Her dry lips moved about with her red tongue. Ah. Ah. Look, the stroller fell. Ah. Can you hear the wailing? The mouth that opened was now splitting sideways. Ee. Ee. The wind blew through the gap. Ah. Ee, that was all she had said so far. Can you enunciate so that I can hear you better? Ah. Ee. Speak louder. Move your mouth more. Ee. 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 She sounds like a broken cassette player, he murmured in frustration. Although her mouth was the only feature on her face, she still couldn't say anything. Juho was growing impatient and anxious at the eerie sight. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He couldn't afford to overthink things. I'll wait here, so tell me. Ah. EU. She moaned with her long, thin lips. He carefully observed her face. It wasn't easy to look for an expression in a face without eyes or nose. Still, he kept his eyes fixed on her. How are you feeling? The shape of her mouth didn't change. How did you feel when you found me? Her lips got even thinner. I could have been too slow. They kept getting thinner. You said you're sick of something. Her stomach puffed up. It bulged out more than her breasts. Her bloated stomach sank back to its place, and he felt her breath on his cheek. He saw her teeth between her rolled-up lips. He saw her tongue. It was all red. You've been smiling. Juho smiled with her. Slowly, he walked away from her. He wanted to hear more, but he had to stop for the day. Tap. A small, hail dot-like thing fell from the sky. It was a piece of debris of some sort. Then, it started pouring like rain, but what fell cracked like it had been shattered. I'll come back another time. With those words, he opened his eyes. He couldn't remember how long he had been keeping his eyes closed. As he sat there exhausted, Juho felt something wet on his feet. Ah! The glass of water had fallen on the floor. Thankfully, none of the pages were wet. It had been a good thing that he had kept the glass on the desk, so that he could clean his room. Well, I guess the adults want us kids to listen to them for a reason, he thought. Mother. There were countless mothers in that world. A woman who delivered life, and then the life that was bound to fade away. After staring up at the ceiling for some time, Juho reached for his pen. In the end, he didn't clean the water until it was close to dawn. Alright, eyes on the board. Math class. As he scratched his eyes, he took out a small notepad from his pocket. Juho had bought one after the incident at the hillside, and it was small enough to be portable. He had tried writing out his story in a notepad. Looking at the scattered fragments of the story, he thought, it's not enough. It lacked too many things, much like the faceless woman. Meeting a character had always been exhausting. Whenever Juho started a conversation, they answered honestly. Of course, the woman had just started talking, but she was incapable of saying words or sentences. It was a proof that her character hadn't been fully formed yet. I'm sure she'll look more like a person the next time I see her. Once again, he organized what he had written on his notebook. There were plot holes throughout. Whether it was a person or an event, he needed raw material in order to fill those holes. Juho tried to imagine the forthcoming path of the protagonist and looked around to see what he could find, but the fog was too thick. He couldn't see anything. Yet, there was one thing he wanted. He wanted something that would work in contrast with the dark overall tone of the story. He was looking for something that stood out at a glimpse, yet stayed consistent with the rest on the inside. The issue was that he had no idea where he could find such a thing. He tried searching through his thoughts. There were passing images, but nothing popped out. He needed something veiled and somewhat discreet. Inner thoughts, feebleness, hesitation. What surrounds these words? So if you substitute this part with one. He was getting too sleepy. Juho tried to shake his head as hard as he could, but he couldn't resist his heavy eyelids. Considering he had been up almost all night, how sleepy he was made perfect sense. Having two jobs was not easy. Therefore, we can infer the solution through this process. Yawn, Juho yawned once again. He tried to stay awake as he wiped the tears that oozed out of his eyes, but it was no use. I gotta get some shut-eye. I'm sure Seo Kwang will wake me up. I'm sorry, Tiak. The math teacher's voice slowly faded away. His head fell lower and lower, and he didn't fight to stay awake this time. After sleeping through his afternoon classes, he barely woke up and walked over to the science room. With Seo Kwang nagging him to wake up, he opened the door. Sun Hwa and Bom were already there. Hey, they greeted like usual. There was nothing different except for the coldness in the air. After staring at the two for some time, Juho opened his mouth, I'm asking just in case. What? Did you guys get into an argument? There was a visceral response from Sun Hwa and Bom, but it wasn't until after a few seconds later that they denied him. Yep, they did, Seo Kwang murmured. Nope. Juho knew their answers weren't entirely sincere. He was incredibly surprised to learn that they had fought. There was a crack to their already fragile friendship. Though they were pretending to be okay, a relationship leaning one direction was susceptible to fall apart. The two were not on good terms. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? He felt an itch at the end of his fingertips and decided to learn more about what had happened. But before he could say anything, at that moment, the door slid open. It was Baron. Though they greeted one another like usual, he had to have noticed the coldness in the air also because he also looked at the two girls and asked, Did you two fight? Nope, Sun Hwa answered. However, no one believed her. The tension was apparent even at a glance. They were usually talking and laughing together, but this time, neither was saying a word. I don't think you're being honest. We didn't fight, Bom answered, but her expression was saying otherwise. It was obvious something had happened. Then, Mr. Moon walked in, and he too asked the same question as the others, did you two fight? Nope, Bomb answered again. Mr. Moon looked at the two girls briefly and added, if you're interested in applying for an essay contest, come find me in the staff room. Juho and Baron, if there's another contest you'd like to be a part of, come see me. Yes, Mr. Moon. Even as the rest of the club members answered, Juho couldn't open his mouth. Seo Kwang started poking his side, wanting for an explanation, but Juho wasn't sure what to tell him.